Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Rainford Cornish. I'm a teacher here in Brampton, Ontario. I'd like to apologize for the delay in starting this presentation. I had it ready to go, and then all of a sudden it stopped, and I had been trying for the last half hour. It's telling me camera issues, but we're ready to go now. Technology can be a good servant, and also, when it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But we're ready to go, and we thank you for your patience as we move forward. This presentation today is entitled Establishing Black Power Settlements on Canadian Soil, from the East Coast to the West Coast. Establishing Black Power Settlements on Canadian Soil, from the East Coast to the West Coast. Now, as we begin, I'd like to first quote from John Henry Clark, an African-American historian, who once said, "To control a people, you must first control what they think about themselves and how they regard their history and culture. And when your conqueror makes you ashamed of your culture and history, he or she needs no walls and no chains to hold you. The chains of your mind are more than enough." I like that quote because it is empowering to the extent that it's telling me we need to understand and appreciate our history. Let not the ones who once conquered us write our history for ourselves. We need to write it. So this presentation is talking about people of African descent who have been visiting Canada since the 17th century. If you go back in history, you recognize the first Black person in Canada on record is Matthew de Costa, a Black salesman who came to Canada in around 1605 with the French. He was an interpreter between the French and Mi'kmaq Indians. Following him, thousands of Black Americans fled to Canada, many as free men, others as slaves, who were loyal to the British Crown during the American Revolution. These were called the Black Loyalists. Before the U.S. Civil War, the famous Underground Railroad, an informal covert network to help fugitive slaves to freedom, greatly increased the flow of Black immigrants to Canada. That's around from the 1830s to the 1860s. The only possession with which these fugitives arrived were their torn and tattered clothes and great enthusiasm for their newly found freedom. They were destitute, they were ill-clothed, they were ill-fed, underfed. They were ignorant of the conditions that awaited them. Yet, they were excited to come to Canada. The transition from bondmen to free men and women was difficult. The new settlers needed two things. They needed land and education to cultivate the land. The twin goals of acquiring land and education were yet elusive, and in some cases, downright impossible to attain for the aspiring Black population. But please understand that even at this time, Canada was as much a racist society, though one wouldn't admit it, as the United States. Ida C. Greaves note that although some free Negroes migrating from the northern states had property and experience and came bringing horses and wagons, sometimes buying their own land, these were a small minority. The others were from the start in need of all necessities of life. So by the mid-19th century, Black people constituted one of the largest group of settlers to immigrate to Canada. They tried settling down into the white communities, but prejudice and misconceptions about the Black race forced them to seek solace elsewhere. Rarely have they ever been acknowledged as one of the founding groups of Canada. Rarely have they ever been acknowledged as one of the founding groups. Despite being segregated and eyed with suspicion, Black immigrants defied the odds and eked out a satisfactory standard of living for themselves. One thing was for sure: they were tired of constantly moving from place to place. They wanted to settle down. Their resilience showed forth when leaders of the anti-slavery societies in Canada and the United States enthusiastically embraced the idea of setting up model communities for the new arrivals. Some of these communities have since faded away, but their survivors went on to establish themselves firmly on the Canadian landscape. But before I go any further, just a little bit of trivia here. How many of you recognize, those who are watching on Facebook, that Canada's first Prime Minister was married to a Jamaican woman? Oh yes, there she is. John A. Macdonald's second wife was Susan Agnes Bernard, who was born on the beautiful island of Jamaica, near Spanish Town, Jamaica, August 24, 1836. Oh yes, her family owned the Bernard's Blood Sugar Estate, which is still in operation in Jamaica today. There's a map of the sugar estate, still in operation. There it is today on the plantation in Jamaica. They met while they were in London in 1866 and married in 1867. She was given the title Baroness MacDonald Earnscliffe. She died in England in 1884, at age 84. So let's go on now to some of the oldest communities in Canada. This is where the presentation gets interesting now. As I said, some of the oldest Black settlements were found in Nova Scotia. Beginning in the 1700s, thousands of Black men and women fled to Canada following the outbreak of the American Revolution. Approximately 2,500 slaves accompanied their masters. These were known as the United Empire Loyalists. They moved to the Maritimes, while another 3,000 came as free men and women or escaped slaves. These became known as the Black Loyalists. As I said earlier on, they tried settling down in white communities and they were not welcomed. So what the Black men did and women is to establish their own communities. Canada's oldest Black community is found in Nova Scotia. It's called Birchtown, Nova Scotia. Birchtown was linked with the founding of the neighboring town called Shelburne in 1873. Amongst the early settlers were 936 free slaves, the Black pioneers. And then in 1873, a second larger group of Black loyalists joined the original settlers. They were directed by Governor John Parr to settle on the fringes of Shelburne. But even settling on the fringes of Shelburne, they were still not welcomed by the other Canadian settlers, Canadian residents who were living there. So they said, we're going to establish our own community, our own settlement. So here then we have Birchtown, which was named after the ex-commanding officer, Brigadier General Samuel Birch, an official who helped lead the evacuation of Black loyalists from New York. And then they were also helped by Colonel Stephen Bluck, who was originally from Barbados. And so the Black settlers dug in and established themselves in Birchtown, Nova Scotia. This is the oldest community. All loyalists, well, listen to this carefully. All loyalists were promised free land and provisions for 3 years as payment for their loyalty to the British Crown. Okay? But the British had developed a reputation of reneging on their promises to its Black subjects. And so they had to wait until 1788, fully 3 years after the white settlers obtained their plots of land. And even then, the land that the black settlers received were not that great. They were smaller than the ones given to the white loyalists. And they were 5 miles away from Birchtown. But there's something about the black race that were very resilient. Given just a chance, given just an iota of chance, we're going to take it and make the best of any situation among which we find ourselves. The black historian William Spray said, blacks receive 50 acres or 20 hectares, while whites receive anywhere from 100 to 1,000 acres of land. Although the blacks were usually given poor land, which no one else wanted, or land that was far from the main settlement, it was almost impossible to establish farms. In the few cases where they received land that the whites, in the few cases where they received land that the whites wanted, blacks were forced to move elsewhere. They received little support by way of provisions and supplies. Instead of 3 years' worth, most got provisions for only 5 or 6 months. And even then, they had to work before they received anything. The blacks in general were much worse off than the whites, and their needs did not get the same attention as the white loyalists. But again, the resilience of our brothers and sisters shone forth because they made Birchmount a community for which they were justly proud. Eminent black leaders made Birchmount their place of residence, including David George from Boston and Colonel Stephen Bloke. Okay? Boston King was a multi-talented individual who adapted his skills to whatever circumstances demanded. He also lived in Birchtown. He was a carpenter, shipbuilder, fisherman, missionary, finally a pastor. But then King also left Birchmount after a while. You see, there was a time when blacks were smitten by the Back to Africa movement, and so they went, he and many others moved to Sierra Leone off the coast of West Africa. Birchtown began to decline because of competition from Shelburne, which is more white-owned, white-governed. And so the black settlers who possessed skills would go to work in Shelburne for lower wages. They would go back to live. And then white laborers didn't like it, so they rioted as well. Okay? They rioted. Can you imagine that? This is the first riot on record, race riot in North American history. In the end, over 20 homes and businesses belonging to black families were destroyed. Okay, Birchmount, poor land, inadequate supplies, harsh climate, discrimination, broken promises left many Birchmount residents disillusioned. Now, I'm going to transition to another great black neighborhood that developed, and this is the most famous of them, is Africville. Again, many of the black loyalists found their roots in Africville as far back as the 1700s. They were promised equality, but ended up selling themselves into slavery in order to survive. 3,000 blacks entered Nova Scotia, as we said. Many of them settled on the outskirts of Halifax following the War of 1812. Okay? There's an image on the screen now that shows a dump truck. I'll tell you a story about that in a little while. The first land was purchased in Africville was in 1848. Africville was a tight-knit community of law-abiding, tax-paying Baptist citizens who did their best to survive in the conditions that they faced. By 1849, the newly formed community had established a Baptist church, the Seaview African United Baptist Church. It was small, but it was the spirit of Africville. it was the heart of Africville. Many black residents, many Africville residents said as long as the church was there, they would be there. The church was the heart of the black community. Africville was located on the northern end of Halifax. Okay? Africville was eventually destroyed by the city of Halifax. The residents were moved. In fact, their homes were bulldozed. Their church was demolished. Their businesses were demolished. They were moved forcibly by the city of Halifax to a housing complex that the city hastily developed for them. This tight-knit community lost its soul when the city forced the black settlers to move out. But this was their home. This was their home. They built their houses. They built their houses. They built their church. They wanted to govern themselves. What's left of Africville today is just a monument that reads, dedicated in loving memory of all the black settlers and all the former residents of the community of Campbell Road, and all the members of Seaview United Baptist Church, and the first black settlers, William Brown, Thomas Brown, and John Brown. To lose your wealth is much. To lose your health is more. To lose your life is such a loss that nothing can restore. Africville. This community was eventually destroyed by the city of Halifax in late 1960s. In fact, the last resident moved out in 1970. You could see earlier when I told you about the dump truck in front of the house. That's the house. Pa Carvey was called. Moved out of Africville. And listen, these guys use dump truck. Can anybody use a dump truck to remove the residents? A dump truck. Finally, Halifax mayor apologizes. I don't have time to read through all of this, but I'll just read one paragraph of it. On behalf of the Halifax Regional Municipality, I apologize to the former Africville residents and their descendants for what they have endured for almost 50 years. Ever since the loss of their community that had stood on the shores at Bedford Basin for more than 150 years. You lost your homes, your church, all the places where you gathered with family and friends to mark the milestones of your lives. For this, we apologize. That's Africville, my friends who are watching. Now let's move on to Prince Edward Island. You see, this presentation is about black residents all across Canada. Prince Edward Island. The history also dates back to the 1700s, when many free black men and women, black slaves, accompanied their masters. Okay? Approximately 2,000 blacks came to New Brunswick. Approximately 2,000 blacks came. 400 to 500 settled in New Brunswick, the rest in Nova Scotia. They settled in the Willow Grove area near Loch Lomond, New Brunswick. 371 refugees were given licenses of occupation for 50 acres of land in 1817. 1825, those who remained on the land were given 99-year leases. By 1836, they bought titles to their land for 20 shillings. These men and women were determined that they need to govern themselves. And the only way they were going to do it is to establish their own black power settlements. So if you go to the Charlottetown today, you will see an area called the Bog in Prince Edward Island. This is where most of the black residents settled in Prince Edward Island. Okay? An area called the Bog. The region bordered on the west by Government Pond, Black Sam's Bridge, and West Street. On the north by Houston Street, extending south along Rockford Street, and so forth. At the height of its existence, nearly 100 black people settled in the bog area. The bog is known for, the Charleston black community owes its development and leadership to the former slave named Samuel Martin. Martin was born sometime between 1753 and 1755. He was owned by Thomas White of Charlottetown, and he was nicknamed Black Sam. Okay, and to him was credited the founding of Prince Edward Island's black community in the bog area. Samuel Martin made a request on August 12, 1812 to the Executive Council of the town of Charlottetown for an empty lot near Government's Creek in the west end of the town, and he was denied. A year later, that plot of land was given to James Bignell, a white settler. But by then, Samuel Martin had erected a house on this property, and he refused to move. Martin marketed himself as a licensed chimney sweeper and supplemented his income by selling alcohol. He says, "This is my plot of land. I built my house," and he would not move. They had their own school. Anglican diocese led by Reverend Carver Richardson, opened a school for the people of the bog in 1848 with an operating budget, get this, of £5. £5. The Colonial Church Society in London, England, later increased the school's annual budget to £15. Around 1840-55, the legislature granted the school an annual stipend of £10. But again, the indomitable spirit of the black community shows forth with those meager budget, they were able to educate their children, because you see, the education is key to the development of the black race. Education, I'll say it again, is key to the development, the growth and development of the black race. Okay? Now, some of the occupation of these people in the bog, they worked as laborers, fishermen, carpenters, tinsmith, coppersmith, blacksmiths, servants, and so forth. They were industrious people. Famous black islanders, Miss Sarah Harvey, the longest serving staff member in the school for over 50 years, from 1848 to 1903. She was paid £20 for her services, £20 per year for her services. Prince Edward Island, the bog especially, is known for producing some of the great boxers that distinguished themselves in fights in the United States. You may or may not have heard of the first black boxer called George or Old Chocolate Godfrey. He was born in 1852. In the 1880s, he became one of the best heavyweight fighters in the world, beating both black and white opponents. Okay? He was undefeated until 1888 by an Australian. He retired from professional boxing after winning his last fight in Baltimore. Then you have this other boxer coming out of the bog, George Budge Byers. Man, this is rich Canadian history. I get excited about this. Born June 25, 1872. By 1890, he moved to Boston and developed his skill down there in Boston. He retired from boxing in 1903. He managed a boxing school in Boston. It's called the Scotland Square School right in Boston. Look at this other one. Samuel Edgar Langford. One of many black boxers denied a championship fight due to racial discrimination. He took on every fighter he could, from lightweight to heavyweight, in his 24-year career. He was known as the Boston Tar Baby, or Boston Terror, or Boston Bone Crusher. ESPN called him the greatest fighter nobody knows. While many boxing historians consider Langford to be one of the greatest fighters of all time. I tell you, this is a little community called the Bog. Wow, I'm excited when I read these stories. But the Bog descended, of course, in decline by emigration, redevelopment, and assimilation. Many people leave to go back to to go work in other places in Charlottetown, Nova Scotia, and so forth. Present-day Charlottetown citizens may not quite know that they once lived in their midst several groups of blacks who were born and raised in their city. But it was, if you ask me, a black power town. Let's move on to Ontario. And I have to rush through this. I'm sorry we started late. I apologize once more. But I want to get into Ontario. One of the first settlements I'd like to talk to you about is the one called Wilberforce. First black settlement to establish in Ontario. Was started by a group of blacks from Cincinnati and Ohio between 1829 and 1830, fleeing the Ohio black law. Okay? Israel Lewis and Thomas Crispot were elected to survey a site in Canada to which the Cincinnati blacks could settle. They met with John Colborne, Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, to discuss prospects of settling in the area. Now, friends, the settlement they established was known as their settlement they established was named in honor of William Wilberforce, the British champion who fought for the end of slavery in the British Empire. Okay? With the help of Quakers in Oberlin, Ohio, they purchased 800 acres in Biddulph Township from the Canada Company in 1830 and established their own settlement. Political growth began. A board of managers were elected, primarily to oversee the financial matters. Austin Stewart was president. Within 3 years, 32 families were living in the settlement, with 3 schools. And the school was integrated because it attracted students from the white population as well. They had their own sawmill, their own homes, and their own general store. This was a black power settlement. A black power settlement. Okay? American social reformer and abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison visited the colony in 1831 and noted that there were 20 to 30 children attending the school. By 1835, there were about 150 to 200 families who were living in Wilberforce. Okay? Its population dwindled after the 1840s, possibly because residents found it difficult to move from life in urban settlements and so forth. But several settlers who stayed on, including Peter Butler, former slave from Maryland, remain in the area, the Wilberforce Colony Village, and they still have descendants there today. There's a plaque in honor of the Wilberforce settlement. I'm going to move now to Dawn Settlement. We're still in Ontario. The Dawn Settlement was established in 1842. I love the settlement. Birth of Dawn Settlement signaled the emergence of black consciousness, much the same way as the start of a new day brings life to its fullest extent. This settlement was started by a black abolitionist, Reverend Josiah Henson, a former slave, and his family who escaped to Canada via the Underground Railroad. He was assisted by Hiram Wilson, a white congregational missionary and abolitionist from Boston, and James Fuller, a Quaker from New York, in laying the plan. The Quakers are the Society of Friends provided the startup capital of $1,700 for this new settlement. The creators of Dawn Settlement were determined that this be a successfully established and run settlement. Hence, he was committed to self-help. And thus, he wanted to establish a settlement complete with its own school. There it is again, own school, where blacks could be taught skills relevant to their survival in an ecologically hostile environment. Again, friends, key, establishment of a school. The community of Dawn made education and training top priorities. Education, the British American Institute, that's the name of the school, provided education for children and adults from diverse backgrounds. Blacks, whites, natives, and they all attended. It was an integrated school. Industrial and manual training was emphasized. Soon they began a lumbering trade with England and the United States, coming out of a black community called Dawn. Training, Josiah Henson insisted, was necessary for the upliftment of those who would otherwise be overlooked by the dominant culture. Training, education. And so for the young people who may be tuning in and watching today, I'd like for you to pay attention to these statements. Education is necessary for the upliftment of those who would otherwise be overlooked by the dominant culture. The key to your success, the key to the success of the black community is going to be our education. In 1848, there were 70, 1845, there were 75 students enrolled in the school. A biracial management board was set up. 3 whites and 3 blacks were set up to govern the settlement in Dawn. Okay. At its peak, there were over 500 residents in this community of Dawn. They had 2 newspapers jostling for people's attention in Dawn. One was the Voice of the Fugitive, and the other was the Provincial Freeman. Okay? The Voice of the Fugitive and the Provincial Freeman. Okay. Now, growing pains is often problematic. It's true. By the 1870s, Dawn had developed serious problems. Some of it has to do with mismanagement of funds, but what can we say? These are men and women who had no training in terms of how to manage funds. They were escaped slaves. So they did the best they could with the little training they had. Okay? Robin Winks, in his book, The Blacks in Canada, contend that unclear aims, poor management, religious sectarianism, and black factionalism held back Dawn from the beginning. But what Winks failed to understand, that these are escaped slaves who wanted to better themselves with whatever little training they had. In fact, they had no training at all. They were using the skills and little knowledge they acquired along the way to establish themselves in a new hostile environment, to eke out a living for themselves in the Canadian North, the Great White North. They did the best they could based on the knowledge and training that they had. And so the black settlement in Dawn began to decline. It says pressures from the white neighbors who feared the existence of a large community of blacks so close to them. Can you imagine that? They feared that community of blacks so close to them. It would be a formidable force to be reckoned with. And then these 2 newspapers had, one was supportive of the abolitionists, one was more integrationist. There was some feuding going on in between them. Nonetheless, they were still speaking for the black community. Self-help was at its base. Okay, lessons from Dawn. They're far-reaching. The experience gave black people a real chance in managing their own affairs and taking charge of their own destinies. For the first time, they enjoyed unbridled independence and control over their futures. Dawn also provided a sense of community, a togetherness, and composure that could not be enjoyed anywhere else. The black fugitive slaves arriving in Canada lived in relative peace so long as Dawn was in existence. So, friends, another community in Ontario is the Elgin Settlement. This is a premier black power town. And this settlement was started by Irish Presbyterian minister named William King. Okay? William King, while living in Scotland, he did welfare work amongst poor neighborhoods in Edinburgh, and he developed a zeal to serve the less fortunate. So when he immigrated to the United States with his parents, they owned slaves. William King did not like it at all. So when his parents passed away, he immediately freed all the slaves that he owned. He freed them. And then he moved to Kent County near Chatham, Ontario, and set up an all-black colony. An all-black colony in Chatham, Ontario. Hedley Tullow states that Reverend King believed that the colored race is able and willing to support itself and capable of moral and intellectual culture, and that education is the great leveler whereby to elevate mankind to a high moral standard. The settlement was named after Governor Lord Elgin, who gave 9,000 acres of land for its creation. The Elgin Stock Association was set up. The Elgin Association was set up. A stock company was formed to raise money for and to be the legal representative of this colony. Elgin had its own post office, its own courthouse, hotel, general store, 2 schools, library, and a church. The settlers worked as blacksmiths, farming, carpentry, shoemaking. These were not people who depended on the state. No, these are people who were industrious in this model community. That they wanted to show that, again, that we are capable of elevating ourselves above the standard where we were before. And so this community of around 2,000 residents by the 1860s, okay, had over 5,000 acres of land under cultivation. Can you imagine 800 acres used as pasture? Enrollment in the school grew from 78 students in 1852 to 150 students in 1855. This is a truly black power settlement called Elgin. Look at this, standards of practice. Concerning property ownership, land was sold at the price of $250. Land was sold at the price of $2.50 per acre, with an annual interest. Man, I wish we could go back to those days. $2.50 per acre. And then you could pay for your land in 10 equal payments over a 10-year period. Residents received the deed to their property once they completed their payment. All land had to be purchased rather than leased. And in the Elgin Township, only blacks could purchase land. And they had to hold the land in ownership for at least 10 years. In Elgin, houses could not be smaller than 24 by 18 by 12 feet. They must have a front porch. They were to be constructed 33 feet from the road and enclose a picket fence and a flower garden. The settlement was built upon moral foundation. No alcohol was permitted. neither for social occasion nor for personal consumption. Elgin settlements. These rules paid off in the long run, for the Elgin settlement, now known as Buxton, remains today as a testament to Black achievement. I'm so happy with this. William King, the town's benefactor, had secure voting rights for Black settlers. But engulfed in a sea of white settlements, the right to vote was a remarkable privilege and achievement for the residents of Elgin. Nonetheless, there was prejudices that persisted, and I think I'm going to leave that for now in the interest of time. Elgin's demise. Elgin gradually declined, and the Black population never again reached its level as it was in the post-Civil War year. In 1873, the Board of Directors of Elgin Association, including Reverend King, was disbanded. Okay, and so Elgin was now on its own. Reverend King, however, served until the time of his death in Chatham, Ontario in 1895. But despite the pressure, despite the prejudices, this again was a true Black power town because they governed themselves effectively. In summary of the character of Elgin settlement, Daniel G. Hill writes, Reverend William King successfully established Canada's only self-supporting Black community. At a time when most people doubted the natural abilities of slaves or free people, Elgin proved that Blacks could develop and progress enormously. Today, remnants of the once burgeoning Elgin settlement can be seen in the community of Buxton, Ontario. Another Ontario community, which is where the museum for which I'm presenting today is located, is in Amherstburg, Ontario, the gateway to Canada West. Located near Lake Erie on the banks of the Detroit River. This Amherstburg was an important entry point for runaway slaves to Canada via the Underground Railroad. Founded and settled between 1784 and 1796 by loyalists who, like the slaves, sought refuge in Canada following the outbreak of the American Revolution. Amherstburg. Its population became diversified during the 1850s when numerous Blacks came seeking freedom from slavery. There's some famous African Americans who visited Amherstburg. Levi Coffin in 1844. He was an unofficial director of the UGR, Underground Railroad. Coffin mused that Amherstburg was the most significant point of call for the Underground Railroad due to its proximity to USA. Amherstburg over time developed share of racial tension. Successful Black businesses became the target of attacks from whites who opposed to having a Black settle among them and to see their prosperity. The Black settlers were law-abiding people, but the white settlers felt that they needed military protection against a possible Black uprising and requested that soldiers encamped at Fort Malden remain in the area to help if needed. Can you imagine that? They were living peacefully in their community, and the whites feared that, oh yeah, we may need some protection from the Blacks. Yet there was no history of Black settlers attacking any community in Canada, any other neighborhood in Canada for which they were settled. Churches also discriminated against the Black settlers, so Blacks were not allowed to worship with white. The Black settlers banded together to form their own organization called the Amherstburg Regular Missionary Association in 1845 in response to the need for fellowship among themselves. And speaking about discrimination in the church, that's another presentation I have developed as well. Why do we have a Black church, the development of a Black church in Canada and the United States? Amherstburg still exists as a burgeoning Canadian settlement that was once populated by industrious, hardworking, freed men and women who escaped from slavery in America, and a museum that is dedicated to keeping alive the memory and experiences of these men and women. I'm going to take a few more minutes and run quickly now to Alberta, and then I will pause for some questions. Alberta. I'm going to tell you about a community in Alberta called Amber Valley. About 1,000 blacks immigrated from Oklahoma between 1909 and 1912 and settled in Amber Valley, Alberta. This was the northernmost settlement ever inhabited by blacks in Canada. It was originally called the Pine Creek Settlement, but it was later changed to Amber Valley by the new residents. The blacks exodusters, these are black people who were fleeing from the black laws or the discrimination they faced in the Reconstruction era after the U.S. After the Civil War during the Reconstruction era, and many of them were fleeing to places like Kansas, Texas, Oklahoma, and so forth. When Oklahoma gained statehood in 1907, the new government swiftly enacted Jim Crow laws. You see, by then many blacks had escaped to Oklahoma. And so this new government established Jim Crow laws, laws providing for systematic discrimination against blacks. And so what many of these men were doing, they said, okay, instead of staying in Oklahoma, we're going to move further north. At the same time, Canada was aggressively recruiting settlers from the United States to come to Canada, Canadian prairies. So blacks in Oklahoma, although they were not the intended audience, they seized upon the opportunity to move to Canada. Black homesteading communities were formed in Maidstone, Saskatchewan, in Wildwood, in Lobstick Lake, in Brayton, and Amber Valley in Alberta. Reaction to the black settlers when they moved to Alberta. Stuart Grow pointed out that no one should, actually here's what he says, Stuart Grow says, blacks were among the group not considered right for settlement on the Canadian soil. Edmonton Board of Trade said, those Negroes who had been here for some time have had a square deal and been treated as whites. But if you get a few thousand move in, conditions would be much changed. United Farmers of Alberta, we consider Negroes undesirable as fellow citizens of this province. In 1911, the Edmonton Journal ran this a headline: "We want no dark spots in Alberta." The Board of Trade once again resolved that this Board of Trade views with its very serious concern that the influx of Negro settlers into the central Alberta, which influx is increasing with alarming rapidity, and if unchecked, promises in the near future to have a disastrous influence upon the welfare and development of this fair province. So, as if those sentiments were not enough, here's a kicker now. In 1911, right, the Canadian government passed this order in council on August 12, 1911, for a period of 1 year from and after the date thereafter, the landing in Canada shall be, and the same is prohibited, of any immigrants belonging to the Negro race, which race is deemed unsuitable to the climate and requirements of Canada. The Negro race, the black race, deemed unsuitable to the climate and condition requirements of Canada. So they were discouraged. They sent representatives down, the government sent representatives down to Oklahoma to convince the black settlers not to move to Canada. Okay? Now, in the interest of time, I won't be able to finish Alberta's story. But if you allow me the indulgence of taking 2 more minutes and talk about blacks in British Columbia, in Salt Spring, British Columbia. You see what I'm trying to show you who are watching today, that the black community established, black presence is established from the east coast of Canada to the west coast of Canada. We set up black power settlements. And so on Salt Spring Island, British Columbia, beginning in the 50s, black Americans lacking basic human rights in the US saw British Columbia as a place of freedom. Okay? The blacks in British Columbia, Governor Douglas invited them to move to British Columbia. They received land, the right to vote, and became part of the local government. These are the blacks in British Columbia. Salt Spring Island, they were situated in Salt Spring Island. As I said, James Douglas attempted to set up an all-black colony, much the same as those in Ontario and Nova Scotia. Okay? They wanted to set up an all-black colony, but Governor James Douglas said, no way. The governor's disallowance placed the black settlers in a disadvantaged position. The first preemptions for land were taken by a group of 16 whites. Preemption is the act or right of buying land before or in presence of others. At the same time, only one black person was allowed to buy land. Okay? One of the famous residents in British Columbia in the Salt Spring Island is Sylvia Stark, the matriarch of the Starks clan, who was a slave in Missouri. And her father worked for a German baker named Charles Leopold. They escaped to Canada as well. There were no doctors in Salt Spring Island, so guess what? Sylvia Stark became the town's doctor. She performed doctoral duties for her family. She was a volunteer nurse and midwife on the island, helping to assuage the physical hurts of all islanders. So, what we have noticed in this brief presentation today is the existence of black communities from the east coast of Canada to the west coast of Canada. We have seen that despite the obstacles thrown in their way, they have managed to eke out a living for themselves. They have managed to establish communities. They have managed to govern themselves successfully. And so today, the African presence can be seen from the icy shores of Newfoundland, across the rugged terrain of Ontario and Quebec, through the undulating plains of the prairies and the rough ridges of the Rockies, and onto the sun-bathed beaches of British Columbia. We have established a presence from the east coast to the west coast of Canada, establishing black settlements along the way, and proving once and for all that black people are capable of governing themselves effectively. And so, let it not be said that we have no history in Canada, or we have not been here contributing to the growth and development of this country, because history has proven otherwise. That even before there was a nation called Canada, that Black men and women have been here as nation builders. Thank you. And I'll pause here for any questions that we may have. Okay, I'm going to check in the comment section here. I see. Yes, thank you for your comments. I see several comments here. Thank you so much for responding to the presentation. Trying to see if, and it will this be available to watch later? I am headed to work now. I am sure the museum will make this presentation available as well on its site, yes. Yes, it says so there. Let me see if there's any more question here. I see my sister today, the same remains, education is key to success. From my sister Sonia, thank you. I'm looking here. Excellent information, thank you very much. When will you be presenting on discrimination in the church? I'd love to attend that one too. You know, that's to be determined. I have a presentation on that. In fact, I didn't get permission from the museum to say this, but I don't know if I can, because I'm developing a manuscript which includes the presentation I'm doing here today. And there is a chapter in there on the Black church in Canada, and the discrimination in the Black church, and why wasn't there a need for a Black church. And my research mainly is Canadian perspective. So my research is on the Canadian, just Canadian, Black Canadian history mainly. So to be determined as to if I will do a presentation on the Black church. Does PEI still have a Black community? Do they commemorate the settlement in any way? There is still a Black community, yes, in Prince Edward Island. In the Bog area, there's still Black living in the Bog area in Prince Edward. And yes, they still have commemorations. And by the way, while I'm at it, if you notice, I skipped over Quebec. I didn't have time to go through all these, but in Montreal, there are Black communities in Montreal, in an area called the Little Burgundy area in Montreal and Quebec City. Okay, these are historically Black communities in Quebec as well. And every year they have their commemorations. They have an association that celebrates the history of Blacks in Quebec as well. How long have you been researching Black settlements, and which settlement were you most surprised to learn about? I have been researching, put it this way, my research on the Black settlements came about as a result of part of my research into Black history in Canada. And if I tell you a little bit about what got me interested in this, you may have heard from the introduction earlier that I'm originally from Jamaica. And so when I went to university here in Canada, in Toronto, I won't name the university right now, but I remember sitting in a course one day, and the guest lecturer was a PhD student, was talking about Confederation, talking about the founding fathers of Confederation, the founding nations as well. And so he enumerated the British and the French and the First Nations people, the indigenous people, that they were here at Confederation. He mentioned that there were a few Irish people at Confederation. And I'm sitting in the lecture hall thinking, why isn't he not mentioning it? Why didn't he say anything about the Black residents who were in Canada at Confederation? And this was a huge lecture hall on campus. And I interrupted his lecture because I asked him why What happened to the black settlers who were in Canada at Confederation? His response was the number of black settlers in Canada at Confederation in 1867, the numbers were so negligible, there's a term, negligible, that he did not bother to list them. With one sweep of the brush, he dismissed almost 400 years of history of blacks in Canada. From 1605, starting with Matthew de Costa, under the rug. The numbers were so negligible, he didn't bother to list them. I was floored. And that spurred me to start digging deeply, because by then I was just in Canada about 3-4 years. I wanted to know more about this country that I've so come to love, and I started digging deeper into Canadian history, Canadian black history, and I stumbled upon that we have a black presence from Nova Scotia to British Columbia that many people don't know. So I've been doing this for over, I don't know, 20 years now. Researching and writing periodically, presenting on black history in Ontario, in Manitoba, wherever I get a chance to. So that's a long answer to your story, how long I've been researching about black settlements. It's been a while now. Which one was the oldest settlement in terms of population? Or the largest in terms of population? Population-wise, it would have been, it's a toss-up between Elgin settlement, because at its height, Elgin had over 2,000. So it's a toss-up between Elgin and Africville. I know Africville is more famous because of what happened to it, but it's really a toss-up between these two. Those were the two largest settlements, black settlements in Canada. Okay, let me go down. Education, tell you all the bulldozer the black population use when he's using to claim their rightful place in society. Okay, that's right. Excellent. Amherstburg is another one. Chatham has such a rich history. That is true. That may be a topic for a future presentation. Yes, Chatham, Sarnia. There were so many other places I could have mentioned. There's a rich history, black history in Sarnia. There's a rich black history in Windsor. There's Oro, Ontario. There's a black community that it's north of Barrie. I forget the name of it right now. But there was a black settlement just north of Barrie, Ontario as well. Okay? And I don't want anybody watching from other provinces. In Winnipeg, Manitoba, by the way, there's a Black History Association out there. They were black residents, historical black residents in Manitoba, and in Winnipeg to be more specific. Okay? Just waiting to see if there's any more questions here. If there isn't, will I get a notification from the... Oh yes, Owen Sound. Yep, there is a presence in Owen Sound as well. There is a presence in Owen Sound. It wasn't part of this research focus, but I'm developing more of these smaller neighborhoods and townships that a black presence was established. Historic black presence was established. Okay, I'll keep going here. Niagara region, rich, steeped in black history. Toronto neighborhoods, steeped in black history. Okay. I don't know if there's any more questions. Is there any more? If not, will somebody notify me or? But this was an exciting experience for me. I relish doing these presentations because we need to understand, folks, that I see Black Canadians as nation builders. We're not just latecomers. We've been here. As a matter of fact, if you read the story of Matthew de Costa, I mean, he was in Canada before the founding of Quebec City, Canada's oldest city. Quebec City started in was established in 1608. Matthew de Costa was in Canada in 1605. And some sources tell us that he was in Quebec City when they were drafting up the documents for that settlement in Quebec City in 1608. Superb sailor, navigator, linguist, spoke Mi'kmaq, Pidgin-Bisque, Dutch, French. And that's a presentation I'd like to do too, because if Matthew de Costa came to Canada in 1605, and he was able to be a translator between the French and the Mi'kmaq Indians, how did he learn the Mi'kmaq language? Is it possible that he visited Canada before 1605, that they have him on record of being here? That's a research that I'm looking into. I see my wife on. Thank you, Dr. Sonia Rainford Cornish. She says, awesome presentation. Thank you. Amherstburg, we will let you know any further question. Thank you. Well, thank you. I must say again, a heartfelt thank you to Dr. Lorraine Briggen Lenny. Amazing, and we've been back and forth so many times getting ready for this presentation. Thank you for the opportunity to share this experience with your viewership and your readership. And I look forward to continued partnership with the museum as we tell the story of Black people in Canada. Okay. I'll just wait a signal as to when there's any more question. Oh, there's a question. Where is Amherstburg Museum? Amherstburg, Ontario. Google it. What's the exact location? I should have had that in my right on the tip of my finger. Somebody may want to help me with the exact address for the Amherstburg Museum, because that's a question that is posted here. Amherstburg Freedom Museum. Any more question? Oh, there it is. Thank you so much. 277 King Street, Amherstburg, Ontario. 277 King Street in Amherstburg, Ontario. I have not been to that museum yet. I've been down to Uncle Tom's Cabin. I've been down to another one that's close by. I forget the name of it. But I'm due to visit Amherstburg Freedom Museum in the near future. Okay. Any more questions that we could, before we sign off? Okay. Yes, I just want to know when to sign off. Oh, I'm sorry. I just want to find out when is a good time to sign off. This is Rainford Cornish doing the presentation live on Facebook. I need to know when to sign off. Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Let me get back on here. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if there are no more questions, I'd like to thank you once again for tuning in today. And stay tuned. Please check out the Amherstburg Freedom Museum website and keep abreast of what's happening on their Facebook page. I'm sure they have a rich repository of history there, collection of Black history in the Southern Ontario region, and in fact all across Canada. So thanks again for the opportunity to do this presentation, and I look forward again to the collaboration. I'll be signing off now unless, I'll be ending this video now unless there is any final statement. Thank you. Have a good day.